All right, so at this point, I already have my sketches all drawn out. I have a few colors that I'm gonna use for sort of my base pre-mixed. I've got my little cup of water here, and what I'm gonna do, what's called some hard edge painting. And this can be a little bit tricky for students at first when they're just learning. But basically what we wanna do, let's see if I can rearrange myself, is we want to get our brush so it has some paint stored in the bristles. So I'm just kind of pushing it back and forth in my paint palette until it has a nice amount of paint. And then I'm holding it almost like a pencil, and I'm just gonna be pulling the paintbrush in a continuous motion. Now this is kind of gonna be a good test to see how much coverage my paint gets, if it's able to cover up much of that pink background. It's not doing bad. It's a little bit transparent, but not bad for one coat. So if you're worried if yours is kind of transparent, if you have a lot of background showing through, just remember it needs a few coats before you're going to get perfect coverage. So that means you have to paint a coat, let it dry, go back, paint another coat. Don't just pile on wet paint on top of wet paint on top of wet paint, because that's not going to help anything. That's actually just going to increase your dry time. Thin layers are going to be much easier and much faster to dry. So I'm just doing hard edges. I just pull the paintbrush kind of towards me, and I'm using my flat brush. And if you find some places you can't quite squeeze it in because it's a little too detailed, you can switch the size of the brush you're using, but try to pick a paintbrush size that is appropriate for your object. This is a pretty big object, so I'm using a pretty big brush. I think this is like a 1/2 inch. Okay, so here's my base layer. Everything is still drying. You can see little pockets right here where there's still kind of a bead of wet paint. So I do need to give it a little bit of time, but I think the shapes are looking pretty cool. The coverage is definitely not even though. It needs more coverage so that the greens can be really vibrant and pop out. So I think what I'm going to do for this second layer, now that it's dried a little bit, is I'm going to start to add in some different various tones of green, because I feel like it just needs more variety. I don't want it to all be like solid. So I'm going to do a loaded brush technique where I get some of my dark green, some of my light green, a little bit of like the blues that are still hanging out around the edge. And I'm just going to start to paint in my second layer.